This is a short version of a long presentation. Here are the key points of this and the longer presentation. First, few people donate to help pay the cost to run or rerun for Congress. As a direct result, our economic system has become rigged to favor those who do donate. The system is rigged for the donors. What's been the result? We've crippled our Congress and divided our nation. This is not just bad for our nation. Given our nation's role in the world, it ultimately risks all of humanity to the effects of dictatorship and climate change. But really, donors are not donating that much money. If we look at the amount of money that was donated in the last midterms, it was roughly $9 to $10 billion. That's 1/10 of 1% of the nation's GNP. Given that it was spent over 2 years, it was closer to 1/20th. It's about the same or half the amount of money that people in the United States spent on Netflix. Now, what is the significance of this 1/10 or 1/20th of 1%? Well, you would expect to pay a fiduciary financial advisor 5 to 10 times that much to manage your money. But the donors are not fiduciaries. While donors have various motives, probably mostly good and some bad, they're not necessarily out there to benefit the rest of the population. In fact, we can show that the policies adopted have been quite damaging to the bulk of our population and the nation as a whole. What can we do about this? We can set up a system of campaign finance vouchers. In this shorter video, I'll not take time to define what we mean by that. The longer version does. In this video, I'm more interested in convincing you that we have a problem suitable for treatment. The main point is that a campaign voucher system, changed in ways described in the longer video, would make donors of everyone, that is, all voters. Not only would it end up costing donors a lot less money than our current campaign finance system, but it would ultimately avoid massive financial and economic damage to the nation. We would see many results. The voters would return to being the primary influence on Congress rather than just donors. Government would start working again. Government would make fewer stupid decisions. That would be better for everyone, even for the donors. How do we get there? We will need inspiring leadership. We need our leaders to inspire the public to donate enough to wake up our members of Congress and to demand that they pass the legislation needed for campaign finance vouchers. This is the basic outline of this and the longer presentation. First, I talk about what a mess we've created, talk about signs of the mess, and demonstrate how those signs align with donation patterns. Next, I explain how our current methods of financing election campaigns led us into this mess. It's a complex, multi-part problem that needs a bit of historical context. Why is it, after almost 200 years, that campaign finance has such a power now? Why are we on the verge of flying apart in an eruption of cultural resentment? The third section, that I only hint at in this shorter video, is devoted to laying out the steps needed to bring about healing change, including steps to inspire unity and generate support for proposed legislation. Here I'm listing the main takeaways for each of these three sections. First, the mess section. The big takeaway: Americans are very unhappy with their government. We have an immune system against such unhappiness. It's called control by voters. We have significantly weakened that immune system. There are many symptoms of an ongoing infection. The biggest one: too much of the population, the system feels rigged. Trump picked right up on that symptom. His election and continued popularity reflects the reality of that rigging. If the mess is a symptom of an active infection, what is the disease? I call it campaign finance disease. It's a new disease. Like COVID, it needs a new targeted cure. In the second section, the Explain section, I go into the history, the logic, and especially the misunderstandings that dominate discussion. Those misunderstandings have kept us from coming to grips with this disease. Finally, in the third, the do section of the longer video, I discuss the only viable, achievable solution: campaign finance vouchers. Vouchers are a tested cure that needs to be developed further and deployed ASAP. I recommend a somewhat non-traditional approach and knock down the many tantalizing non-solutions based on those misunderstandings that divert us away from the voucher cure for this disease. But most important are the immediate steps we need to take to get there, and by acting, motivate legislators after 2024 to enact the legislation to set vouchers in place and cure this disease. It's clear that the public knows we have a problem. Gallup's monthly survey asked people to name the country's most important problem. Concern about government has jumped to the top. With the Tea Party, this grew from the fourth to usually the top. In the past 10 years, it was topped 7 times, twice second to the economy, and once second to COVID. Question is, do the public know where the problem comes from? I don't think they do. What are the signs of a government in crisis? These 4 seem the biggest. All are direct results of our bad campaign finance system. First, we have a severely divided population. The country is convulsed with fear and cultural hatred. Second, our Congress has become impotent. It cannot produce laws or budget. Only the leaders have power. Other members are slaves who must vote the party line on any issue of substance. They cannot compromise and have little or no power to influence legislation. Third, an impotent Congress weakens the presidency. Without a working Congress, presidents have little power to lead. They have resorted to using their only remaining tool, executive actions. But executive actions are not laws. They're simply things the current president can temporarily do. Last, the courts are heavily populated with people who are appointed without large Senate endorsements. They are viewed by the public as heavily partisan, as representatives of their party. There are less obvious signs of distress. First, the system is economically rigged. This was Trump's claim, and to almost half the voters, the truth resonated. Our policies, especially tax policies, favor the successful, the rich, and the special interests. They are basically against almost everyone else. Resentment about the results fed support for Trump. With Trump, they found a king and fed on 2 decades of cultural attacks by Republicans seeking campaign donations. He helped them find lots of groups to blame. Finally, the U.S. system is based on 2 parties. With 3, we can't govern. As local issues like guns, abortion, and health care linger, we cannot deal with the catastrophic threat of climate change. Here are examples of how campaign finance has rigged things. Item 1. There was no national political response as huge improvements in the productivity of our agricultural and industrial base crush the heartland of our country. You see, the impacted workers and communities may be large in voters, but quite small in the 2 parties' true focus, campaign finance donations. Item 2. Hooked on campaign donations from Wall Street, in the 1990s, both parties put on blindfolds and told regulators to keep looking the other way as banking crooks were allowed to bring on the Great Recession. Protected by their campaign donations, there was no jail time for the crooks. Coming on top of the growing damage to our heartland, we saw popular outrage. Much of that outrage had a name, the Tea Party. In 2015, it got a synonym, Make America Great Again. Item 3. In the past 3 decades, to please campaign donors, we twisted our so-called progressive tax system, including, most significantly, the inheritance parts, to enrich the rich and favor the successful. For the successful, those with jobs that put them in the upper half, these expensive tax cuts and credits all seem perfectly innocent, all while leaving decorative crumbs and huge budget deficits for the rest. Items 4 and 5, reflecting the cumulative effect of these donor-favored tax changes, inequality has steadily grown. We are no longer the land of opportunity for our children. Why does the U.S. still have, by far, the highest child poverty rate in the developed world? Why do we so undervalue the benefits to us all from a cohort of healthy kids? Well, poor parents vote, but they don't donate. Item 6. A major source of the feeling that the system is rigged is the question faced by most: will I be able to retire? The answer increasingly is no. A weak system based on pensions that worked reasonably well for many has been replaced by an extremely expensive system of 401ks and Roth. While they sometimes work well for those in the highest 20% of income, for employees of modest means, they have massive flaws. Options used in other countries would be much better for those with modest income, but people with modest income are not campaign finance donors. Finally, of course, item 7, unanswered spending by fossil fuel companies has left our children holding the bag for the climate disaster. Indeed, the system is rigged. How did campaign finance come to dominate our government? Money has always been important, but prior to the 1990s, by and large, voters ruled. Money became more important in the 70s and 80s when we switched from using conventions to using primaries to nominate candidates. Primaries are inherently more expensive to run than conventions. Initially, not much changed. In 1990, we sent the savings and loan crooks to jail. By the 1990s, expensive primaries drove parties to focus on donors and donor-friendly policies. The rigging started. But how has this led to the broken government we see today? First, the rigging damage, especially the job losses in our heartland, differed dramatically between rural and urban congressional districts. Second, along with their conversion to be the face of racism in the South, the Republicans, under Gingrich, found that emphasis on cultural divisions were a wonderful path to donations. Confused, the Democrats drifted rightward, helping carrying the rigging along, until Trump woke them up and opened a countervailing donation faucet, all of which has driven both parties away from the middle of the electorate, who are increasingly independents, unwilling to say they believe in either party. Third, our election system is based on closed primaries with only two parties. This gives little room and no money for middle-of-the-road candidates. Together, this has led to a dramatic decrease in competitive seats and an increase in safe seats, where winning the primary guarantees a win in the general election. But a safe seat member needs loads of campaign money only if there's a primary challenger, which is rare, but most voters are not donors. Hence, the member is heavily dependent on the big donors to swoop in if he faces a primary. This shift has created a situation where most congressmen are essentially slaves to their party, forced to spend most of their time dialing for dollars. They cannot work on public business or learn what non-donors want. They have virtually no freedom to vote for the unique interests of their own district. This, in turn, has made compromise among the parties impossible. Without compromise, effective government is essentially impossible. This is what has shut down our government and turned our country into such a mess. Surveys indicate that the public is suspicious that campaign finance money might be involved somehow in explaining their unhappiness, but they tend to see it as corruption in the old sense, as personal greed. It's not that simple. The real story hasn't been understood, and its messengers just throw up their hands, implying the situation is hopeless. We need to ask our voters a simple question: have you donated? The usual response: hell no, with lots of reasons that represent severe public misunderstandings. So whose interests are paying our political leaders, our pipers, and whose interests are being ignored? 29% of us donate. The rich and special business interests, as usual. Voters focused on single issues such as guns, abortion, environment, and climate are reliable donors. The successful donated enough to have their interest show up in 401ks and tax credits. 71%, the rest of us, may vote but don't donate. Do they know what this free thing is costing them? What are the misunderstandings that keep us from curing our campaign finance sickness? First, while there have always been donors, now donors rule. Second, the system is corrupt, not the politicians. It is trapped. Third and fourth, donors are not evil. We just gave them rings of power they couldn't control. Good intentions are no substitute for perspective. We now need to spread that power over all voters. Fifth, vast amounts being spent? No. 1/20th of 1% of GNP? If we spent our Netflix money on it, the show would be much better. Sixth, rich always win? No. Money buys visibility. With enough visibility, money rapidly loses its additional power. In the third part of the longer presentation, I go into the steps needed to solve our campaign finance problem. I talk about a campaign finance voucher program, which I claim is the only solution that is viable and achievable in the time frame we're talking about. That is, get support for it organized for the 2024 election and get the legislation enacted after that election, regardless of which party wins that election. What is that solution? A national program to send campaign donation vouchers to voters. Vouchers they can use to donate federal tax money to candidates. Enough money that voters become heard, without mandatory restrictions on private giving that would invite court rejection. Though we do need to ensure sufficient, though not perfect, visibility on such giving. It's the only solution. We should reject other approaches. It's a viable solution. It's worked where it's been tried. Using the steps I lay out, it's achievable legislatively, administratively, financially, and judicially. Please look at the longer video for more discussion.